In the quiet English village of St. Mary Mead, secrets lie buried beneath the rose gardens and stone walls. Secrets so dark they were never meant to surface. A young maid with a dangerous past. A family desperate to keep appearances. A silent witness who sees more than she ever says. And when the night falls and the wind whispers through the hedges, someone will cover her face forever. Tonight, we unravel the mystery of life, death, and the dreadful price of truth. This is Agatha Christie's Cover Her Face, a tale of subtle dread, elegant deceit, and the quiet terror lurking behind every polite smile. Chapter 1. The Village Sleeps. Dawn rose reluctantly over St. Mary Mead, a hesitant light seeping through layers of mist that clung to the hedgerows like a shroud, softening the angles of cottages and turning cobblestones slick with dew. A distant bell tolled from the ancient church tower, its tone low and mournful, echoing through narrow lanes where not even the earliest postman had yet stirred, and in that heavy silence the village itself seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for a disturbance it could neither name nor prevent. At the edge of the green, a stately house loomed beneath towering elms, windows dark and unwelcoming, and at its gates a black cat sat poised, eyes glinting in the muted dawn as though it alone knew of the upheaval poised to shatter the fragile peace. It was there, through the grand iron gates of Marchwood Hall, that Sally Preston arrived, her figure small beneath the weight of her battered trunk, face pale but eyes bright with an emotion difficult to read, a secret perhaps, or a memory that kept her spine rigid despite her apparent youth. She had been hired in haste, or so the whispers claimed, a last-minute replacement for a maid who had vanished without a trace weeks prior, and as she crossed the threshold into the grand foyer, the air seemed to tighten, a subtle shift like a room exhaling after holding tension too long, a detail so slight one might miss it entirely if not for the watchful gaze of Miss Marple, who stood half-hidden behind a grand urn of wilting lilies. Lady Sylvia, regal in her starched black dress, greeted Sally with a nod that conveyed both superiority and weariness, her eyes sharp as cut glass beneath the veil of courtesy. Beside her lingered Sir Robert, tall, lean, his posture rigid, hands clasped as though holding in words he dared not speak aloud, a man whose alibi for every night of his life seemed always prepared. And in the shadows at the edge of the grand hall, Miss Marple remained silent, eyes flicking from one face to the next, cataloguing every gesture, every fleeting glance, as though each tiny clue might one day prove to unlock an unsolved riddle. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, for as Sally lifted her gaze to the portrait above the fireplace, the painted eyes of a long-dead matriarch appeared to shift, following her with unnerving precision, the cracked varnish lending a shimmer that caught the weak light in ways that made the hair at the nape of her neck stand on end. Even the grand staircase, rising in two dark sweeps like the wings of a waiting predator, seemed to groan a warning as the new maid stepped forward, her footfalls muffled, yet strangely loud in the hush, and from a corridor unseen, the sound of footsteps emerged, slow and deliberate, fading before they could be traced. A telegram, unopened, rested atop the marble-topped console, its edge torn but not fully broken, as though someone had hesitated at the last moment. The scent of candle smoke lingered in the air, despite none being lit, and far above, the ticking of an heirloom clock echoed steadily, each second a quiet reminder that time was moving inexorably towards something none of them could yet name. In the kitchen, the staff gathered in uneasy silence, eyes darting toward the ceiling at the muffled voice of Lady Sylvia ordering Sally to her duties. A whispered rumor slipped between the cook and the scullery boy, a mention of a previous servant's sudden disappearance and the odd stains found upon the pillowcase of her vacated bed. But when Sally stepped into the great hall once more, every tongue fell still, and the house itself seemed to listen. Miss Marple's thoughts moved like a chess master's pieces across the board of this new arrival, considering every possibility, a double life hidden beneath a maid's cap, a motive undisclosed but lingering, a legacy of old resentments woven through polite words, each possibility alive with cryptic undertones, each shadow a potential suspect. She knew well the weight of secrets, the ease with which a facade could slip, and the speed with which quiet civility could shift to murderous rage when truths were threatened with exposure. And yet there was something else, something unspoken in the set of Sir Robert's jaw, the tremor that passed briefly through Lady Sylvia's hand, the way the black cat's tail twitched twice at the moment Sally first laid eyes on the cracked portrait. Details so minute they would have meant nothing to anyone else. But to Miss Marple they felt like the faint outlines of a confession waiting to be coaxed into the light. Dear listeners, if you have found yourself enraptured by the whispered clues, the delicate dance of deception, and the sense that each quiet moment holds the promise of a shocking twist, I invite you most kindly to subscribe now, so you may join us for every secret yet to be revealed and never miss a chapter of our tale that winds ever deeper into the heart of St. Mary Mead's unspoken horrors. And as the first rays of the reluctant sun reached the chimneys of Marchwood Hall, illuminating the black cat as it rose and slinked into the mist, Miss Marple's voice, soft yet carrying an edge honed by years of careful observation, drifted across the hush of the waking village. Sometimes evil arrives on quiet feet. From the high attic windows of Marchwood Hall, the mist outside appeared almost alive, drifting past ancient panes that trembled softly in the morning breeze, blurring the line between sky and earth until the hedgerows and low stone walls dissolved into a shifting canvas of gray. Down in the village, shopkeepers raised their shutters without knowing that this would be the day their routines would fracture, that whispers of scandal would soon float from the green to the parlor from the church. Steps to the back rooms of the post office, carried on the same cold breeze that pressed against Sally Preston's thin coat as she was led by the head housekeeper to her quarters at the far end of the east wing. The hallways of Marchwood were labyrinthine, lined with portraits whose eyes tracked one's progress, and Sally's hurried steps seemed to echo with unusual clarity, each tap upon the polished floor a tiny challenge to the hush that had reigned in these corridors for generations. A corridor turned left, then right, each bend revealing small details of the hall's once proud past. A cabinet with a broken lock, a tapestry depicting a hunting scene in which the fox's eyes were too knowing, a vase, with a hairline crack like a silent threat, until at last the housekeeper stopped, produced a heavy iron key, and unlocked a narrow door that opened onto a tiny room smelling faintly of lavender and candle wax. Sally set her trunk down at the foot of a narrow bed and looked around, noticing a diary tucked into the corner of a drawer left ajar by her predecessor, its cracked spine bound with a ribbon so frayed it threatened to split at a touch. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the cover. But before curiosity could overtake caution, a sharp knock rattled the thin wood of her door, and a voice called her name. Not the housekeeper's voice, nor any voice she recognized from the hall, low, quiet, and gone before she could fling the door open to peer into the empty corridor where no footsteps retreated. Beyond the hush of the east wing, Lady Sylvia's day had begun with the same rigid precision she demanded of the staff. Her breakfast tea prepared in a silver pot that had belonged to her grandmother, her letters arranged by importance, and her gaze fixed upon the morning paper she scarcely read. Sir Robert, meanwhile, had retreated to his study, a room filled with old ledgers, locked drawers, and the stale scent of pipe tobacco, where he sat in a high-backed chair, staring at a telegram he'd folded and unfolded so many times its creases were nearly worn through. A telegram that contained a single cryptic sentence capable of toppling the fragile peace he guarded with every breath. In the village below, Miss Marple moved quietly from the baker's shop to the post office, exchanging pleasantries with those who offered them and lingering just long enough to note which neighbors asked after the new maid and which pretended ignorance of her arrival. Each clue gathered, each motive considered, and each conversation tucked neatly into the folds of her mind. For there was an art to revealing the truth, and an even greater art to letting it ripen until it could expose itself. Without force, a red herring here, a whispered rumor there, and the stage was nearly set for a revelation none would expect. Back at Marchwood Hall, Sally's morning chores took her through rooms layered with the weight of unspoken stories. A library where a clock chimed an hour wrong. A parlor where an heirloom music box played a tune slower than memory recalled. And the grand dining room where the long table seemed too empty for its size. A void that magnified every faint noise until even the brushing of Sally's skirts across the floor sounded like a challenge to the hush. And as she passed beneath the portrait once, more, the eyes in the cracked varnish caught the morning light and flashed a warning no one else was there to see. Somewhere near the west staircase, footsteps moved at an hour no one ought to be awake. A door clicked softly. A curtain swayed though the window was latched, and in the air hung the faintest whiff of something sweet yet cloying, as though a perfume used only in secrecy had been spilled and hurriedly wiped away, but not before its scent clung to the shadows. Sally paused, senses sharp, hearing a voice whispered just beyond the limits of recognition, a word that might have been betrayal, or merely the wind, and when she stepped into the hall once more, she found the corridor empty, yet felt watched. Downstairs, the cook shared a whispered speculation with the scullery boy that Sally Preston was no ordinary maid, that her arrival so soon after the vanished girl's unexplained absence could not be coincidence, that someone must know why Marchwood Hall staff had begun to thin without explanation. And as the boy asked who might be responsible, the cook fell silent, eyes shifting to the grand staircase, voice dropping to a tone meant only for herself. The quiet ones are the ones to watch. High above the hush of the ground floor, Miss Marple ascended the servants' stairs, the wood creaking in quiet protest beneath her deliberate steps, her mind tracing each whispered exchange she had overheard that morning like a cartographer charting a treacherous coastline. The cook's hushed worry, the fleeting look of guilt in the gardener's eyes as he crossed paths with Sally on the east lawn, the butler's sudden inability to meet her gaze when she inquired, quite innocently, about the last time he saw the girl who had so recently vanished from these same corridors. Each small detail a separate clue that, when carefully aligned, formed a portrait of a household trembling beneath the weight of secrets exposed. In the drawing-room, Lady Sylvia sat with perfect composure, but the tightness around her mouth and the way her gloved hands fidgeted with the tassels of her shawl betrayed a mind in turmoil. Beside her, Sir Robert's face was a mask of stoic detachment, yet the repeated clearing of his throat, the way his eyes flicked to the clock on the mantel as if measuring time itself for a violent reaction, suggested a man for whom the final hour might be approaching faster than he dared admit. And behind them, unnoticed yet watchful, Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the subtle shift in the polished floorboards near the hearth, a scuff mark fresh enough to have been made only hours before, and pointing toward the very corridor Sally had been seen hurrying through in the dawn gloom. Sally herself moved about her tasks with a precision that belied the tremor in her hands. She dusted picture frames whose glass caught reflections that did not belong, smoothed linens that crackled as though hiding more than their embroidered patterns, and paused once, just once, before a locked room where the doorknob felt strangely warm beneath her touch. She could not explain why her heart quickened at the sight of a telegram half tucked beneath the door, its edge torn as though seized in haste, its presence a silent testament to an unspoken communication that someone had desperately tried and failed to conceal. In the hall, the butler stood at rigid attention, yet his eyes darted toward the library each time a floorboard moaned. The scullery boy, pale and thin, carried trays with the anxious care of one who feared each clink of china might invite punishment, and the housekeeper's voice, sharp and clipped, cut through the morning air like the toll of a distant bell, her tone betraying a determination to maintain order over a staff increasingly convinced that Marchwood Hall was no longer merely a grand house, but a locked room full of unsolved puzzles. Outside, the mist lifted only reluctantly, revealing the village green where a group of farmers had gathered in low conversation, glancing toward Marchwood's tall iron gates with expressions that mingled curiosity and apprehension. The black cat, now perched atop a mossy wall, tracked every movement beyond the gates with unblinking eyes. its tail twitching each time the front door of the hall opened to admit a messenger or dismiss a tradesman. In these small moments, Miss Marple found her mind drawn to the patterns hidden beneath the village's apparent calm. The sudden scarcity of the postman's visits, the cryptic way the vicar's wife averted her eyes when Marchwood was mentioned, the curious timing of a telegram delivered the night Sally arrived. Within the hall, a thin melody floated from the music room, a single piano note repeated over and over with the mechanical quality of someone lost in thought. It was Lady Sylvia's niece, playing a tune that faltered when Sally entered to dust the pianoforte, the girl's pale hands freezing above the keys as her eyes met Sally's with a mixture of fear and recognition, as though a memory had surfaced unbidden and unwanted from a night best forgotten. The note hung in the air long after the fingers stilled, vibrating with an intensity that made even the heavy drapes shiver, and in that quiet, a new layer of suspicion wrapped itself around the already tangled threads of Marchwood's morning. Miss Marple paused at the threshold of the music room, her gaze flicking from the niece's strained smile to the dust motes dancing in the morning light, to the faint marks on the carpet as if someone had knelt there recently in a hurry, perhaps searching for something fallen or retrieving something best kept hidden. Her voice, soft and deliberate, carried just loudly enough to reach the room's far corner as she remarked, "The most interesting clues, I find, are often the ones left lying in plain sight, waiting for the careful eye to see them for what they truly are." And so, as noon approached and the household settled into an uneasy routine, the village of St. Mary Mead held its breath once more, for while nothing appeared out of place, every careful gesture, every measured word, every anxious glance suggested that at Marchwood Hall the quiet hours were merely the calm before a storm no one yet dared name, and in those silences the true danger gathered itself, ready to strike when least expected. Chapter 2. The First Omen. As the uneasy calm of Marchwood Hall stretched into evening, the fading light pooled in corners and deepened the shadows along the paneled corridors, turning familiar rooms into a maze of flickering candlelight and hushed expectation, a hush that thickened with each hour until the grand dining room, usually a haven of rigid routine, felt heavy with an unspoken anticipation, the scent of roasted meat mingling with the waxy tang of freshly lit candles, their flames dancing in draughts that seemed to slip through the house from nowhere, unsettling both the servants and the family alike. Lady Sylvia sat at the head of the long table, her posture impeccable, her eyes shifting from one place setting to another as if measuring each guest's worth with a glance. Sir Robert, stiff-backed in his high chair, gave polite nods but offered no warmth, his thoughts clearly elsewhere, eyes moving often to the ornate clock on the mantel that ticked softly as though counting down to an hour none of them had yet defined. Miss Marple, positioned modestly along the table's side, appeared absorbed in her soup, but her gaze flicked above the rim of her spoon, collecting details the others discarded without thought, the slight tremor in the butler's hands as he served, the quick exchange of glances between the cook and housekeeper near the door, the tightness around Sally's mouth that spoke of words held back by the thinnest of threads. It was then, with dessert yet untouched and silence stretching long enough to turn uncomfortable, that Sally, eyes wide and face pale in the wavering light, lifted her head as if summoning courage from the very marrow of her bones and spoke in a voice that carried clear and cold along the polished table. "I wonder, Lady Sylvia, if you have ever considered how some secrets, once whispered, have a way of finding their way back into the open, especially when those secrets concern the true inheritance of Marchwood Hall." The words dropped into the room like a stone into still water. The ripple spread instantly, unseen yet felt, Lady Sylvia's eyes narrowing just enough to betray the shock coursing beneath her practiced calm, Sir Robert's knuckles whitening where they rested upon his silverware, the butler's breath catching audibly in his throat. Even Miss Marple, who had prepared herself for many possibilities, noted the note of deliberate challenge in Sally's tone, as though the young maid had rehearsed her provocation for hours and chosen this moment with careful precision. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, for in the instant Sally's words settled upon the stunned gathering, a gust swept along the length of the table. The tall candle before the butler shuddered violently, its flame flaring before winking out, plunging the dining room into a darkness broken only by the weak glow of the candelabras further down the table, their light casting long, restless shadows that made each face appear mask-like, every expression frozen at the edge of panic. The silence that followed was deeper than any that had come before, the quiet humming with a tension so sharp it felt as though the very air might crack. In the dark, subtle sounds took on a life of their own. The tick of the clock grew louder. The faint drip of water somewhere in the scullery seemed like the counting of seconds. A muffled scrape of a chair leg set hearts pounding. And through it all, Sally sat perfectly still, eyes gleaming with something between triumph and terror, her chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths as though she understood fully the magnitude of the storm she had just unleashed. From her seat, Miss Marple's gaze darted to each person around the table, measuring the violent reaction in the flicker of their eyes, the clenched jaws, the forced calm that could not hide the suspicion now sprouting like weeds across the faces of everyone present. In that sudden darkness, every shadow appeared deeper, every pause longer, every clue more cryptic, and with the flutter of the candles, dying smoke lingering like a whispered warning, she knew that what had been set into motion this night would not be undone by morning's light. The darkness did not linger long. The butler, hand still trembling slightly, managed to coax the flame back to life with a match that sputtered before catching, its weak light spreading once more across faces that looked a touch more drawn than they had before the room fell into shadow. Yet with the flame's return came no comfort, for the word Sally had unleashed continued to hang between them, like a cloud no warmth could dispel, every glance and half-swallowed breath betraying the tension, crackling beneath the hall's carefully maintained facade. Lady Sylvia's voice, when it came, was soft yet edged with an authority that had kept Marchwood staff in quiet submission for years. "Miss Preston, you will kindly explain what you mean by such a reckless suggestion, or you will find your stay here very short indeed." Her words slid through the air like the blade of a finely honed knife, each syllable measured, calculated to wound without overt threat. Yet Sally only met her gaze with a calm that belied the quaver in her voice moments before, her eyes reflecting the candlelight like twin mirrors of defiance. Sir Robert cleared his throat so harshly it startled the butler into dropping a spoon, the metallic clang ringing out like a gunshot in the tense hush. His eyes, dark and brooding, settled upon Sally with an intensity that suggested he had considered this exact conversation before, and dreaded its arrival. Miss Marple's attention shifted then, catching the subtle exchange of a quick glance between Sir Robert and Lady Sylvia, a fleeting moment of shared knowledge that stood in stark contrast to their otherwise separate composures, a clue as vital as any confession uttered aloud. Outside the dining room, the house had grown strangely still, the usual nighttime creaks of settling beams and rattling windows conspicuously absent, as if even the ancient walls of Marchwood Hall understood the weight of the revelation threatening to surface. Only the quiet ticking of the heirloom clock reached through the silence, each measured beat a reminder that time was moving forward, unstoppable, dragging every secret closer to the light. It was later, well past the hour when the house normally settled into gentle slumber, that the first hint of something unspoken drifted through the narrow corridors. A lullaby, soft and slow, its notes carried upon the currents of the draughty hallways until they reached Sally's door with a melody that belonged neither to the house's music room nor to any of the household's known talents. It wove a tune both sweet and cold, wrapping itself around the dark like a caress that left a chill in its wake, the lullaby's faint strains shifting in pitch until they sounded almost like a voice whispering a confession long buried. Sally lay awake, eyes fixed upon the darkened ceiling, heart hammering in a staccato rhythm that matched the strange song floating beyond her door. The lullaby rose and fell, a cryptic hymn whose origin she could not place, each note seeming to press more firmly upon her chest until breathing itself became a conscious effort, her mind reaching back for every conversation overheard, every glance intercepted, every clue that might explain the shadowy presence she felt just beyond the narrow slit of light beneath her door. Down the corridor, a faint movement caught the corner of her eye, a barely visible figure gliding past the threshold, too quick for detail yet leaving an impression of a tall silhouette, shoulders hunched as if burdened by rage or grief, feet treading so softly they produced no sound but for the lightest sigh of floorboards. The figure paused for a heartbeat outside her room, its presence a wordless threat, before continuing along the corridor, fading into the deeper darkness at the far end of the hall where the moonlight did not reach. Within the quiet of her room, the lullaby faded into silence as if snuffed out by an unseen hand, leaving in its place a hush so profound that Sally could hear her own breath catching, the soft rustle of the bedclothes sounding impossibly loud. Her eyes darted to the window, where the thin curtain shifted though the night outside was perfectly still, and as the fabric parted just enough to reveal a sliver of moonlit garden, a shadow crossed the pane, a fleeting darkness that moved with purpose, leaving Sally's face frozen in startled terror as she strained to see who, or what, watched from beyond. Sally remained perfectly still, her breath shallow and ragged. As the thin curtain settled back into place, the shadow at her window vanishing as swiftly as it had appeared. Yet the impression of eyes meeting hers, eyes cold, unflinching, and full of unspoken accusation, lingered long after the moonlight resumed its quiet watch over the gardens below. For a moment she dared not move, certain that the slightest shift in her bed might draw the attention of whoever had paused outside her window, might invite them back for reasons she could not guess, reasons that chilled her blood far more than the night air ever could. Somewhere in the distance of the sprawling hall, a grandfather clock chimed a single note, its low tone vibrating through the floorboards like a subtle warning, each reverberation a reminder that time was slipping inexorably forward toward a revelation neither she nor the household could avoid. Outside her door, the corridor lay silent and empty, yet the memory of the figure's footsteps lingered as a restless echo, the cadence of someone who knew every creaking board, every corner where shadows pooled deep enough to hide a secret. Miss Marple, too, had felt the change in the house that night. Even before the unsettling lullaby reached Sally's ears, the old detective had noted the subtle shifts in the hall's pulse, the way the scullery boy hesitated before opening doors, the tremor in the housekeeper's voice as she gave instructions, the way the butler moved through his duties with a mechanical precision that suggested a mind consumed by some unspoken fear. As the hour grew late, Miss Marple sat by her small fire, eyes half closed, recalling each whispered conversation from dinner, each clue slipped like a note between characters, each sudden silence that fell when Sally entered a room, the hallways of her mind alight with connections forming as she traced the threads of motive, opportunity, and the violent reactions Sally's words had provoked. In the dining room, where the candle's smoke still lingered faintly as a ghost of the evening's tension, Sir Robert sat alone, fingers drumming upon the table in a rhythm that matched neither the clock's ticking nor the faint heartbeat of the house. His eyes, fixed upon the darkened window, reflected a mind lost in thoughts of inheritance and legacy, of clues too long ignored, of whispers that threatened to expose every careful deception he and his wife had maintained for years, and in those eyes, had anyone been there to see them, lay a glint of something close to desperation, a sense that the final hour might be approaching, faster than any of them could stop. Lady Sylvia, in her private sitting room, poured herself a second glass of sherry with a hand that shook despite her iron self-control. Her eyes scanned the pages of an old diary she had kept hidden at the back of her wardrobe. The edges of its pages curled with age, the ink faded, yet still legible enough to read the confessions of choices made and alliances forged in shadows. Each line reminded her of the secrets she had sworn never to expose, secrets that now pressed upon her chest like a weight she could no longer bear, For Sally's cryptic threat at dinner had stirred long-buried truths back into the light, and in the heavy silence of the hall, even Lady Sylvia's practiced composure felt ready to crack. As the night deepened, the stillness of Marchwood Hall became almost oppressive, each faint creak of timber a jolt. Every sigh of the wind outside, like a whispered word of betrayal, carried from one darkened room to the next. In the servants' quarters, the staff lay restless, eyes wide in the dark, listening for footsteps that never came yet felt close enough to raise gooseflesh. And in Sally's narrow bed, the young maid lay with eyes fixed upon the ceiling, sleep distant and unreachable mind. Tumbling through half-formed thoughts of telegrams she had glimpsed, conversations she had overheard, and faces that now seemed shadowy, suspect, cloaked in a facade of civility, so thin it appeared ready to tear at the lightest touch. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, and in that fragile silence, the seeds of suspicion Sally had sown at dinner began to sprout unseen, winding their way through the hearts of everyone who had heard her words, feeding upon the very fears they had long tried to forget, each secret now alive and whispering in the dark halls of Marchwood Hall, where shadows moved with quiet purpose, and a single question now lingered like the echo of that haunting lullaby. Who among them held the key to a confession that could shatter everything? Chapter 3. Blood on the Pillow. Dawn arrived over Marchwood Hall not with the soft promise of peace, but with a brittle, unkind light that slipped between the curtains and fell upon a household already holding its breath. The morning's hush felt strained, as though the very walls of the old estate anticipated the discovery, waiting to greet the first person brave enough to step into the East Wing's narrow corridor, where silence pressed so heavily it muffled even the steady tick of the heirloom clock. In the kitchen, the staff moved with a hushed dread, each glance a question unspoken, each footstep hesitant, as if every soul within those walls since the final hour of normalcy had already passed in the quiet darkness of the night before. It was the scullery boy, pale and wide-eyed, who first reached Sally's door, his hand trembling as he knocked lightly once, then twice, before daring to push it open. What greeted him stole the breath from his lungs. The narrow bed lay undisturbed save for Sally herself, motionless upon the thin mattress, her face completely obscured by a pillowcase pulled tight around her head, tied in a knot so precise it suggested more than mere panic. It hinted at a purpose both brutal and coldly deliberate. The boy staggered back into the corridor, eyes darting wildly, lips working for words that refused to come as the housekeeper arrived behind him and let out a soft, strangled gasp that carried down the hall like a warning bell. Word spread with frightening speed, seeping from the servants' quarters to the grand halls, until the hush of Marchwood became a tense, quivering silence broken only by the shuffle of slippered feet and the low, urgent murmurs of staff gathering in small, fearful clusters. Lady Sylvia appeared first in the corridor outside Sally's room, robes pulled hastily around her as she absorbed the scene with a single, sharp intake of breath, her eyes darting from the bed to the scullery boy's pale face, as if weighing what story could be crafted before the world beyond Marchwood's gates caught wind of the scandal unfolding in her home. Sir Robert arrived moments later, his expression carved from stone, lips pressed into a thin line that revealed nothing yet suggested everything. His eyes lingered upon the pillowcase in a way that made Miss Marple, who stepped quietly into the back of the gathering, wonder what memories or motives those eyes concealed. For Miss Marple had risen with the dawn, drawn by an unease that had settled into her bones, as she recalled the lullaby drifting through the night, the shadow crossing Sally's window, the lull in the wind that left an emptiness so complete it felt like the world itself had paused in expectation of this moment. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, and as the crowd parted for Inspector Dermot, newly arrived with his small cadre of constables, the first sliver of bright morning light fell upon Sally's nightstand, illuminating a small, faded photograph framed in tarnished silver, a photo that should have shown only Sally's younger face beside an unknown woman, but now included a third figure, a tall, shadowy presence reflected faintly in the glass, a presence no one recognized, and one whose inclusion suggested that the night had held a secret observer whose role in the events was yet unsolved. The inspector's gaze swept the room with professional patience, his eyes sharp yet cool as he took in the details others missed. The faint drag marks on the rug where the bed had shifted, the single overturned water glass beside the bed, the scrap of paper half tucked beneath the pillow, the scent of candle wax lingering though the room's candles sat unlit, and the thin line of smudged dust upon the doorframe as though someone had paused there, hand braced, breath held, considering whether to enter or flee. Miss Marple noted each clue with silent approval, her mind stitching every piece into a tapestry of motive and opportunity, betrayal and fear. Tension rose with every minute that passed. Servants began to whisper of Sally's heated argument with Sir Robert only hours before dinner, voices trembling with the fear that speaking such words aloud might draw unwanted attention. Others recalled the flicker of rage that had passed across Lady Sylvia's face when Sally dared mention secrets best kept buried, and in the hush of the hall outside the bedroom, Miss Marple watched as every glance, every shifting footstep, every whispered question fed a growing sense of panic that threatened to unmoor the fragile order Lady Sylvia had spent years enforcing with the cold precision of a matron who understood that appearances were everything. The first constable stepped back from the bed with a grim expression as Inspector Dermot knelt beside the lifeless figure, his gloved hands moving carefully to untie the cruel knot at the back of the pillowcase. The fabric fell away to reveal Sally's pale features, frozen in an expression that suggested neither peace nor struggle, but something caught in between, as if the final moments had come so swiftly she had no time to register the betrayal. Dermot's eyes narrowed at the details others might have missed: the faint mark upon her neck, the way her hair fanned unnaturally across the pillow, the soft indentation beside her shoulder suggesting a weight that should not have been there, a silent companion present at her final breath. Miss Marple watched from her place near the door, eyes moving from face to face in the room. The butler's complexion had gone a dull gray, his gaze fixed upon the floor, his lips parting only to whisper short, clipped prayers under his breath. The housekeeper, normally so formidable, wrung her hands together as though desperate to scrub away the memory of what they had all found. Lady Sylvia's posture had regained its regal rigidity, yet every so often a flicker of something like panic crossed her features, a tension at the corners of her eyes, a tightening of her mouth whenever Inspector Dermot's questions edged close to topics best left undisturbed. Sir Robert, leaning heavily upon his cane, answered every inquiry with careful, measured words, his alibi recited with the practiced ease of a man who knew precisely where he had been and who could vouch for his movements. Yet Miss Marple noted the subtle contradiction between his words and the butler's hesitant nods, a gap small enough to escape casual notice, yet wide enough to allow a truth far more troubling than either man wished to admit. As the inspector moved through his questions, the room seemed to shrink, the walls leaning inward, every tick of the clock punctuating the growing sense that each second carried them closer to secrets exposed. It was the discovery of the telegram, slipped between the pages of Sally's old diary, its edges torn as though it had been read in haste and hidden again, that shifted the morning's mood from grief to something sharp and electric. The telegram, bearing a date only days old, contained a message so blunt in its warning that it read like the final piece of a puzzle. The heirloom is not yours. She knows. Remove the threat before the scandal spreads. Miss Marple's sharp intake of breath at the words went unnoticed by most, but Inspector Dermot's eyes met hers for the briefest instant, a silent acknowledgement passing between two minds already far along the same path of suspicion. The diary itself proved no less disturbing. Its pages, brittle and stained, contained entries that hinted at a double life, references to meetings late at night, whispered confessions overheard beyond locked doors, mentions of names half crossed out in ink that had bled through thin paper, leaving ghostly shadows of letters Sally had perhaps tried to erase. There were lines that suggested a motive more personal than greed, allusions to a betrayal reaching back years, one so carefully hidden. Beneath the hall's grand facade that the revelation of its existence promised to shatter far more than reputations. Downstairs, as word of Sally's fate rippled through the household, rumors twisted and grew. The stable boy spoke of hearing footsteps near Sally's room in the hour before dawn, footsteps too heavy to belong to the young maid herself. The cook swore she glimpsed Lady Sylvia's robe passing the darkened corridor when all others were abed. And in the library, a glass sat upon Sir Robert's desk, half full of amber liquid, its surface stilled in a way that suggested it had been set down quickly, the rain of moisture beneath it marking the hour when the hall's hush was broken by deeds that could not now be undone. Inspector Dermot, rising from his examination of the body, surveyed the gathered household with a gaze so level it seemed to pin each heart to the wall behind them. His voice, low but firm, cut through the tense hush as he declared, "This was no rash act nor mere tragedy. What happened here was planned with careful malice. It was not murder in the heat of rage, but an execution measured to leave no doubt, a final solution to a problem someone could no longer tolerate." The words settled upon the room like a heavy shroud. Every breath held as the inspector's pronouncement redefined the nature of the night's horror, and in that silent pause Miss Marple's eyes moved slowly from Lady Sylvia's clenched hands to Sir Robert's fixed stare, to the butler's downcast gaze, knowing that the true confession lay hidden still, waiting for the moment when a final clue would force the truth into the light. The inspector's final words lingered in the charged air of Sally's small room, as if the walls themselves refused to let them fade. The household remained suspended in a silence so complete that even the distant cry of a morning gull sounded foreign, unwelcome, and too bright for the darkness that had settled upon Marchwood Hall. The morning light, now high enough to spill fully through the corridor windows, revealed dust motes drifting lazily, each tiny particle a quiet reminder that time moved on even as the truth hovered just beyond reach. Miss Marple moved quietly through the aftermath, her keen eyes tracing details overlooked by those distracted by grief or fear. The faint scratch upon the bedpost, a clue too small for most to register, the twisted corner of Sally's blanket, suggesting a brief struggle that left almost no trace, the subtle scent of something sweet yet cloying lingering in the air, a perfume foreign to Sally herself, a scent Miss Marple recalled catching only once before, during Lady Sylvia's late return from her niece's room after the music had faltered. These small signs, scattered like crumbs, formed a path she alone seemed willing to follow. Downstairs in the drawing-room, Inspector Dermot assembled the household with a gravity that stilled every nervous shuffle. The butler took his place by the door, eyes lowered, while the cook hovered at the threshold, apron twisted between restless fingers. Lady Sylvia sat rigid on the settee, eyes flashing with a controlled rage as she scanned each face in the room, searching for a sign of betrayal. Sir Robert stood beside the fireplace, his hand resting upon the mantel in a posture meant to suggest composure, yet betrayed by the whiteness of his knuckles, his eyes never quite meeting those of his wife. The inspector spoke calmly, his words chosen with care as he laid out the facts of the night before. Sally's challenge at dinner, the lullaby drifting through the halls, the shadow passing her window, the argument overheard by two maids just outside the library. With each point, he watched reactions ripple through the assembled group, noting the sudden intake of breath, the shifting of feet, the quiet tears that sprang unbidden to the eyes of the younger maids who had always liked Sally's quiet kindness. Every whispered clue unspooled like a thread tying each soul in Marchwood Hall to the fate that had met the young maid. And then came the photograph, now laid bare upon the inspector's open palm, its silver frame tarnished, but its contents newly terrifying. The faint figure that had appeared overnight, tall and indistinct, yet undeniably human, standing behind Sally and the unknown woman in the image. A figure who had no right to be there, whose presence had gone unnoticed until the moment the dawn light revealed it with a clarity sharp enough to make the cook's knees buckle as she crossed herself. Inspector's eyes swept the room, his voice low as he asked the question hanging in every mind. Who here has an explanation for the figure in this photograph? No answer came, only the hush of stunned silence, punctuated by the steady ticking of the clock, each tick loud as a hammer blow in the grand drawing-room. Miss Marple's eyes moved from Sir Robert's clenched jaw to Lady Sylvia's trembling hand resting upon the settee's arm, then to the butler's shifting gaze that refused to settle upon the photo for more than a heartbeat. In that thick silence, the threads of the mystery seemed to tighten around each suspect, drawing them inexorably toward an hour when their secrets would be laid bare. And so the morning wore on, each moment stretching the tension until it felt like the walls themselves might crack beneath its strain. The inspector continued his patient questioning, peeling back layers of alibis and quiet deception, drawing out fragments of truth that hinted at an affair, a legacy threatened, an inheritance contested. Each revelation adding a new piece to the puzzle that now sprawled across the grand tapestry of Marchwood's carefully constructed facade. Miss Marple, ever watchful, knew the final confession was near, yet just beyond reach, waiting for one last clue, one final twist that would expose the motive lurking within the shadows of the hall. And as the clock told the half-hour, Inspector Dermot's voice rose with quiet authority, his words slicing through the strained hush. This was never a simple crime of opportunity. It was planned with cold precision, a brutal act intended to ensure silence. The question remaining is, whose secret was worth such a violent reaction? Chapter 4. The Village Rot. As the inspector's pronouncement hung in the heavy air of Marchwood Hall's drawing-room, the sun climbed higher over St. Mary Mead, its rays cutting through the dissipating morning mist to reveal a village already stirred by whispers carried from the grand gates of the estate. News of Sally's fate had spread faster than even the earliest cart rumbling along the village green, each retelling embellishing the details until the quiet lanes themselves seemed to echo with stories of curses and ancient wrongs, of heirs vanished and secrets exposed, of a darkness said to linger in the halls of Marchwood like a stain no washing could ever lift. At the post office, two elderly women huddled close, voices dropping to conspiratorial murmurs as they spoke of a legend older than the hall itself. A tale of a child who vanished into the night generations before, leaving behind a mother whose grief never truly faded, a mother who once threatened to curse the family line until the hall itself rotted from within. At the church, the vicar's wife, her eyes wide with a fear she dared not name, recounted to the visiting curate how her grandmother had warned that Marchwood's legacy carried a shadowy debt, one paid not in coin but in lives caught between betrayal and revenge. Meanwhile, within the cold walls of Marchwood Hall, Miss Marple moved with quiet purpose, every sense alive to the tension thickening in the grand rooms and narrow corridors alike. She had returned to Sally's small chamber once more, drawn by the nagging certainty that a clue still lingered in the hush of the room, and there, tucked beneath the thin mattress, she found a small bundle of letters bound with a faded blue ribbon. Each envelope bore the looping script of a woman's hand, the papers, edges yellowed with years of secrecy, and as Miss Marple lifted the first page to the pale morning light, the words within began to weave a story of debts unspoken, blackmail threatened, and a confession never delivered. The letters spoke of a lost child whose birth had been hidden for the sake of Marchwood's reputation, a child born of an affair that, if discovered, would have shattered Lady Sylvia's marriage and exposed Sir Robert's carefully guarded position in society. There were references to payments sent quietly each month, signed only with the initials R.S., and to a cryptic telegram warning that what was lost must remain lost, or all shall be undone. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the subtle difference in inks across several lines, suggesting revisions made long after the original writing, perhaps in moments of regret or a desperate bid to cover a truth no longer content to remain buried. As the letter's secrets soaked into her mind, the sounds of raised voices drifted down the corridor. Family members, already stretched thin by fear and suspicion, had begun to turn upon each other with accusations sharp enough to wound even before truth could confirm or deny them. Lady Sylvia's voice, high and brittle, accused Sir Robert of betrayal, insisting he alone had the motive and the cold resolve to ensure Sally's silence. Sir Robert, voice low and ragged, fired back that it was Sylvia's jealousy that had driven every violent reaction in their marriage. Her rage had already led to one scandal years before. A scandal buried only by the loyalty of servants now too frightened to remain silent. Miss Marple slipped into the shadows of the hall as the argument swelled. Her thoughts focused not on the shouting, but on the rocking horse she glimpsed through the doorway of the abandoned nursery. It moved with a slow, unnatural rhythm, as though stirred by a hand unseen, its wooden eyes gleaming in the thin light with an intensity that made the old detective's breath catch for the briefest instant. Even the reflection she glimpsed in the nursery's tarnished mirror seemed to ripple and warp, as if someone passed unseen behind her, the distorted image twisting reality just enough to suggest that Marchwood Hall itself was a participant in the unraveling of its own carefully maintained facade. Nothing seemed out of place until it suddenly was, for as Lady Sylvia's voice cracked with a sob and Sir Robert's cane struck the floor with a sharp report, a gust of wind tore through the corridor, slamming the nursery door closed so forcefully it rattled the portrait of a child whose face looked eerily familiar to the one in Sally's photograph, a face now distorted by a crack running across the glass like a scar, whispering of a legacy both tragic and unspoken. As the echo of the nursery door's slam faded into an oppressive silence, the household found itself frozen in a moment that felt impossibly long. Every occupant of Marchwood Hall listening for the next sound to break the spell. Even the scullery boy, breathless from delivering messages between rooms, stood rooted to the landing, eyes wide and glistening as he glanced from Lady Sylvia's tear-streaked face to Sir Robert's stormy expression. Miss Marple, slipping quietly from the shadows of the nursery corridor, moved like a silent observer through a tableau where every glance and flinch revealed a new layer of secrets waiting to be pried loose. In the drawing-room, Inspector Dermot's questioning had taken on a new urgency as he laid out the mounting evidence. The letters unearthed beneath Sally's mattress, the telegram predicting scandal if the truth emerged, the history of an heirloom that had vanished from Marchwood's vaults decades before and was rumored to have resurfaced in Sally's possession. Each revelation struck the assembled family and staff like a hammer blow, shaking the fragile alliance of silence that had kept the halls. Darker chapters confined to whispers for generations. Outside the grand estate, the village had come fully alive with speculation. In the greengrocer's, a farmer with mud-caked boots declared in a low voice that Marchwood Hall was cursed beyond saving, that every generation brought a new tragedy worse than the last. At the bakery, the miller's wife insisted to a growing crowd that she had seen ghostly footsteps leading from the hall's garden gate to the old churchyard, a claim made with such fervor that even the village constable hardened by years of gossip could not dismiss the possibility outright. Every word spoken added weight to the idea that what unfolded within Marchwood's walls was more than a crime. It was the fulfillment of a legacy of betrayal reaching back farther than any living soul could recall. Meanwhile, in the hall's dim library, Miss Marple discovered a letter wedged deep within a crack of the fireplace mantel, the paper yellowed and brittle, the ink faded yet legible enough to expose confessions of debts owed and names blackened by scandal. The letter hinted at a double life maintained by Sir Robert's elder brother, a man whose death decades earlier was ruled an accident, but whose suspicious final days were detailed in cryptic lines suggesting blackmail and a violent reaction. Covered up with practiced ease, the clues buried in those pages stitched together a portrait of a family willing to poison its own roots to protect a legacy already rotting from within. As the day darkened into afternoon, the air within Marchwood seemed to thicken, the corridors growing colder even as the sun shone unseasonably bright outside. Servants moved about their tasks with eyes cast downward, afraid of both discovery and silence, while Lady Sylvia took to pacing her chambers, each step a restless measure of time running out. In one of those private moments, She caught her own reflection in the tall mirror near her writing desk, only to see it ripple and twist as if the glass itself reflected not her face, but her guilt, the edges of her features warping with each shallow breath until she staggered back, crossing herself and muttering prayers once forgotten. From the far end of the east wing, the rocking horse continued its slow, rhythmic sway despite the absence of any breeze or hand to set it moving, the gentle creak of its aged joints drifting faintly down the corridor to where Miss Marple paused, eyes narrowed, mind sifting every confession and contradiction like a jeweler examining a flawed gem. Each hallucination-like moment, the shifting mirror, the rocking horse, the muffled sound of footsteps without a source, hinted that Marchwood's rot was no longer confined to old letters and whispered scandals, but had begun to seep into the very bones of the house, eroding its grip on reality with each passing hour. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, for as Miss Marple descended the grand staircase, a thin wisp of cold air brushed her cheek, carrying with it the faintest scent of lavender and candle smoke, a scent she knew to be Sally's, though the young maid had not drawn breath since the dawn, and as she reached the final step a soft, whispered voice drifted from the shadows beyond the entrance hall. Words so faint they might have been imagined, yet so chillingly clear they left the detective rooted in place. "Who do you believe covered her face?" The whispered question, floating through the empty hall with a clarity that cut sharper than any blade, lingered in the air, slipping beneath doors and curling along the grand staircase until it found the ears of each soul in Marchwood Hall. Lady Sylvia's steps faltered as she crossed the threshold of her bedchamber, the question echoing with such familiarity that she pressed her palm to her breast as though to still a heart suddenly burdened by more than grief. Sir Robert, standing alone in his study, felt the voice brush his ear like an icy breath, his eyes darting toward the curtained window as he wondered whether the house itself now whispered accusations only he could hear. In the servants' quarters, the staff huddled together in fearful silence, the older maids crossing themselves while the younger ones clutched each other's hands, all of them certain that Marchwood's grand façade had cracked beyond repair. They spoke in hushed tones of the heirloom rumored to carry a curse, of debts repaid with silence and betrayal masked by polished manners, each whispered theory darker than the last, each one feeding a paranoia that now bloomed unchecked in the corners of the hall. The scullery boy, who had seen the figure outside Sally's window, began to sob quietly, convinced the faceless watcher still lingered beyond the glass, waiting for the final hour to strike. Miss Marple, moving through the labyrinth of halls with unhurried determination, gathered every detail into her keen mind, the rocking horse's ceaseless motion, the distorted reflection in the mirror, the unspoken confessions laid bare in old letters. She paused outside the library, recalling a line in the final letter, a cryptic phrase warning that when the truth of the lost child came to light, it would unravel every alibi and expose the hidden threads of betrayal winding through the family. Like a rope, even as she pondered these clues, she sensed that the house's hush had deepened, as though the walls themselves held their breath in anticipation of a revelation no one could yet name. The village beyond Marchwood's gates had grown restless. Crowds gathered near the green, eyes fixed upon the estate's tall chimneys, speculations seeding arguments that swelled with each retelling of the night's horror. Some swore they had seen ghostly footsteps in the dew at dawn. Others insisted they heard Sally's voice drifting across the fields in a final, whispered confession. A few remembered old scandals involving the Marchwood line, stories of a double life, kept secret by generations of careful deception, of blackmail paid in silence rather than coin, of a legacy so tainted that no rightful heir would dare claim it openly. Inside the hall, tension wound tighter with every hour, doors slammed without wind, chandeliers swayed with no visible cause, and voices rose in heated arguments between Lady Sylvia and Sir Robert, each accusing the other of alliances and betrayals hidden beneath the polished surface of their marriage. Even the portraits lining the grand corridor appeared to shift in the dim light, painted eyes watching the family unravel as though savoring every confession and violent reaction. Miss Marple alone remained composed, mind piecing together clues as carefully as a seamstress mends a tear. Yet even she could feel the fragile line separating reason from dread wearing dangerously thin. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, for as the sun dipped low behind the hedgerows, a bell began to toll from the distant church, its deep note carrying across the fields to the hall, where it seemed to seep through the walls and settle upon every heart like a shroud. In that somber tolling, the voices fell silent, the rocking horse stilled, and the final question rose unbidden to every mind as the shadows lengthened and the house seemed to draw a long, cold breath. Who do you believe covered her face? Dear listeners, I leave that question now to you, for only in your careful consideration may the truth emerge from the tangle of clues, the cryptic confessions, the shifting alibis, and the legacy of secrets exposed. Tell us in the comments below your suspicions, your theories, your guesses about who among them would risk everything to keep the past buried. And if you are as captivated by this tale as I am honored to tell it, I invite you kindly to subscribe so you need not miss the final revelations waiting in the chapters yet to come. Chapter 5, Night Whispers. The final toll of the church bell faded into the darkness beyond Marchwood Hall's gates as midnight settled upon the estate like a blanket too heavy to lift. The hush within the grand walls grew thicker than it had been all day, the air prickling with the awareness that the question, whispered earlier, "Who do you believe covered her face?" remained unanswered and unanswerable, a question that had already driven rifts between those who called the hall home and set every mind racing with suspicions they dared not speak aloud. And it was in this midnight hour, when even the moon seemed reluctant to cast its light upon the hall's ancient stones, that the first whisper of a truth long buried began to stir. It started with a memory clawing its way to the surface, a fragment of a conversation Sally had once shared with the cook during a moment of unguarded frustration. A name dropped with careless malice, a hint that Sally had come to Marchwood not by chance, but with a purpose sharpened by desperation. For Sally's arrival had followed a telegram she had carried in the lining of her coat, a folded slip of paper bearing words that threatened to expose a scandal only a few in the family circle knew existed. The cook's eyes had gone wide at Sally's casual mention of debts paid in secrecy and a double life maintained through fear. But when asked to explain, Sally had only smiled, a smile that did not reach her eyes, and changed the subject to the soup boiling over on the stove. As the clock struck 12, Miss Marple moved silently along the east wing corridor, her keen eyes flicking from one shadow to another, her mind alive with the weight of confessions whispered too late. She had spent the evening interviewing the staff, each conversation adding a conflicting layer to the night's events. The housekeeper insisted she heard footsteps returning to the servants, stairs long after Sally's screams should have drawn every soul from sleep. The butler claimed he saw Sir Robert entering the library when the hour was far past respectable, and one of the maids, her voice trembling, confessed to seeing Lady Sylvia slip into Sally's room moments before the lullaby drifted through the hall, though even this claim wavered under closer questioning, leaving only more confusion in its wake. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, for as Miss Marple pressed deeper into the quiet of the hall, a soft sob drifted from behind the locked door of the old music room, the sound carrying so lightly she wondered at first if it was the house settling or merely the night playing tricks on a mind already burdened by secrets. Yet the sobbing continued, a low, shuddering sound that rose and fell in waves, each note sharp with despair, each pause heavy with guilt. Miss Marple tested the handle, finding it firmly locked, her ear pressed to the wood as the crying subsided into a ragged silence broken only by the quietest of whispered words. Words she could not fully catch, but that carried enough of a confession to leave her heart pounding with both dread and certainty. Along the corridor, candlelight flickered behind keyholes as eyes peered into the darkness. A servant's hand reached tentatively for a doorknob, only to snatch it back at the faintest creak of a floorboard. In the shifting glow, shadows moved with purpose, their edges sharp enough to suggest the presence of figures too careful to be caught, yet too impatient to remain still. The very air felt pressed down by unspoken truths, the grand house itself groaning faintly as if straining beneath the weight of secrets finally beginning to slip free. Outside, the gardens lay draped in silvered darkness, every hedgerow and low stone wall an extension of the hall's brooding presence. A shape moved among them, gliding with deliberate caution from window to window, pausing to watch the faint glow of candlelight moving within. Its passage stirred no dog to bark, no owl to call. Its quiet journey through the gardens as silent as the guilt festering in the hearts of those who lay awake inside, each wondering who might be awake elsewhere, who might be plotting the next move, who might hold the final clue to a mystery growing more tangled with every hour. The sound of the sobs fading behind the locked music room door left the hall thick with silence, the kind of silence that seemed alive, pulsing with questions no one dared voice. Miss Marple stepped back from the door, her mind replaying every contradiction she had gathered since sunset, the conflicting accounts of footsteps heard, the discord between Lady Sylvia's sharp denials and Sir Robert's practiced composure, the subtle tells of servants who knew more than they would ever admit. Each piece felt like a clue placed deliberately in her path, yet none fit neatly enough to dispel the sense that every revelation was a red herring concealing something far worse. She made her way to the servants' staircase, feet light upon the worn steps, each creak echoing in the stillness, as if the house itself were listening. In the narrow passage leading to the scullery, she paused at a scuff mark upon the floor, faint but undeniable, a sign that someone had dragged a heavy object or perhaps a reluctant person down the hall in the late hours. She knelt to examine the mark more closely, fingertips tracing the uneven line before glancing up to find a maid's wide eyes, peeking from the crack of a door nearby, eyes that darted away the instant Miss Marple's gaze met them, leaving behind the soft hiss of a quickened breath and the certainty that yet another witness had seen what they should not. The night deepened around Marchwood Hall, shadows growing longer as candle flames flickered low in sconces along the walls. Each corridor now felt like a labyrinth woven of unspoken confessions and old rage, each turn hinting at the presence of someone just beyond sight. In the grand corridor leading to the east wing, Miss Marple paused again, her attention caught by the faintest glint of something wedged between the floorboards, a small brass button bearing the crest of Marchwood's founding. Patriarch, a button missing from Sir Robert's favorite dressing gown. She slipped it carefully into her pocket, mind turning over the possibilities. Every theory weighed against the timeline she had so painstakingly constructed throughout the day. In the old nursery, long unused and shrouded in darkness, the rocking horse shifted once more with a gentle groan of aged wood, moving in a slow, unsettling rhythm that seemed to keep time with the faint, uneven footsteps now drifting along the upper landing. The sound of those footsteps carried a hesitant, almost stumbling quality, pausing frequently as if the walker listened for movement below before daring to advance. Miss Marple tracked the sound with keen precision, noting how it led away. From the guest rooms and toward the west wing, the one area of the house long left to gather dust after the last scandal cast it from polite use. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was. From the hush following the footsteps, a soft clink of metal reached Miss Marple's ears, a key turning in a lock somewhere beyond her view. She followed the sound with cautious haste, every instinct sharpened by the knowledge that what happened in these midnight hours would shape the fate of every person still within Marchwood's walls. The corridor ahead curved away, candlelight spilling across the floor from a cracked door, and as she crept forward, her eye caught a flicker of movement, a hand, pale and delicate, withdrawing quickly from the doorframe as if the owner sensed pursuit. From the other end of the hall came a second noise, a muffled sob rising once more, closer now, raw and unguarded, the voice blurred by distance but filled with a desperation so sharp it prickled along the skin. The sound wove through the halls, threading between the hush of locked rooms and the restless shift of portraits in their frames, until it reached Miss Marple with the weight of a confession offered to the darkness. And in that confession, half heard and wholly haunting, lay the certainty that Sally's presence in Marchwood had been no accident, that she had arrived with knowledge dangerous enough to buy silence or command fear, and someone had decided to choose the latter at any cost. The sobs faded into a silence so absolute it pressed against the ears like a weight, the hush of Marchwood Hall now deeper and more oppressive than at any point since night had fallen. Miss Marple stepped carefully through the narrow corridor. Every footfall measured as she approached the cracked door from which candlelight still glowed faintly. Her eyes scanned the shadows pooling at the junctions of the walls, alert for movement, for a shape slipping from one hiding place to another, for the faintest twitch of a curtain or the softest whisper of a breath drawn too quickly. Each heartbeat seemed to echo in the empty halls. Each tick of the heirloom clock from the main staircase a quiet reminder that the night's final hour drew closer with relentless certainty. At last she reached the threshold, her hand hovering above the doorknob, senses alive to every detail. The scent of spent candle wax and old wood mingling with the faintest trace of lavender, a familiar scent that once clung to Sally's clothes, the hush of the room beyond, deep and still, yet charged with the unmistakable sensation of a presence just beyond the reach of sight, the cold breath of air that slipped past her cheek as she nudged the door open, carrying with it the whisper of words, lost to the hush, words that fell like a confession upon her ear, secrets exposed. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, for there, upon the small writing desk tucked into the corner of the dimly lit chamber, lay a diary she had never seen before, its cover cracked and worn from years of handling, its brass clasp rusted yet unclasped as though it had only recently been opened, the diary's pages fanned wide as if flung aside in haste, ink scrawled across them in a hand grown frantic, the words tumbling over one another in a desperate effort to record what should have been kept forever silent. Miss Marple's breath caught as her eyes fell upon the first lines, passages that spoke of Sally's arrival with a motive sharper than simple employment, of letters exchanged with an unnamed figure in the village, of threats made and bribes offered, of an agreement shattered when Sally demanded more than she had been promised. Even as Miss Marple reached forward to turn the page, the room's single candle guttered, its flame throwing a last wild lurch of light that caught upon something dark staining the edges of the diary. Her fingers trembled as she brushed the page, the mark still tacky beneath her touch, its deep red color unmistakable even in the uncertain light. The diary's spine creaked as it shifted, revealing more words crawling across the page like an accusation. She knows. She will expose everything. End this, or we are all ruined. A floorboard groaned just beyond the threshold, a whisper of movement punctuating the silence as Miss Marple straightened, eyes narrowing as she scanned the corridor for the source of the sound. A shadow moved across the far end of the hall, tall and distorted, slipping out of view even as she stepped forward, determined to give chase. Yet as she reached the door, a sudden draught extinguished the candle entirely, plunging the chamber into darkness, so complete she was left blind to the figure, fleeing into the maze of Marchwood's halls, blind to the fresh trail of red that smeared across the pages of the diary in the final moments before the flame's last breath. And in that darkness, filled with the hush of a house no longer content to hold its secrets, Miss Marple knew beyond any doubt that what had begun with whispered threats had become something far more brutal, that the truth Sally carried had been enough to awaken a rage buried so deeply it had taken only the softest provocation to unleash. Yet, as the grand clock struck a low, resonant note marking the passage of another hour, she also knew the final clues lay close at hand, waiting in the shadows for those who dared to bring them into the light. Chapter 6. Unmasked. Darkness still wrapped Marchwood Hall as Miss Marple stood in the silence of the small chamber where the diary lay open. Its final page darkened with a stain that whispered of brutal intent. Outside, the first hint of dawn glimmered weakly at the horizon. Yet within the grand house the night's terrors clung like ivy to old stone, refusing to fade with the approach of morning. The air felt weighted by revelations pressed into its hush, each clue pulling together into a tapestry of betrayal that only a careful eye could read without succumbing to its tangled threads of rage, secrets exposed and confessions uttered in moments of desperation. The diary's entries wove a story so delicate in its initial promise, yet so devastating in its final truth, that Miss Marple found herself reading the words twice to ensure their meaning could not be misinterpreted. Lines hinted at an illegitimate heir born of an affair conducted under the cover of darkness and whispered travels. Notes scribbled in the margins recorded visits paid to small cottages outside the village, letters exchanged with addresses disguised to throw off curious minds. But the final entry stood apart, penned with an urgency so raw it nearly tore the fragile paper. Sally had discovered a child who vanished from record books, but not from bloodlines. A child whose claim could unseat generations of inheritance and cast Marchwood's legacy into scandal. As Miss Marple pieced the timeline together, every hour of the past days shifted into new alignment. Sally's arrival timed to coincide with the anniversary of an old scandal long thought buried, the arguments rising between Lady Sylvia and Sir Robert each evening as though the mere presence of the young maid resurrected their worst memories. The telegrams sent with cryptic warnings about truths threatening to surface. Each clue pointed unerringly to a secret so explosive it could explain the violent reaction that led to Sally's silencing. But only if the identity of the child she uncovered could be proven. Moving through the hushed halls, Miss Marple considered every face she had studied, every alibi offered too quickly or with details too polished. The cook who had seen the tear-streaked niece slip from her room, the butler whose gloves bore a smear of wax from Sally's candle, the stable boy who claimed to have witnessed a shadowy figure passing near Sally's window on the night her screams were muffled by a lullaby. Each story formed a piece of a puzzle, yet the shape of the completed picture still lay just beyond reach, shimmering like a mirage in the dawn's thin light. Nothing seemed out of place until it suddenly was, for as Miss Marple paused by the drawing-room, she overheard Lady Sylvia's voice rising sharp with fear, declaring that Sir Robert's betrayal would destroy them all, that his affair years ago had already condemned them to this moment of reckoning. Sir Robert's response came low and harsh, his words cutting through the hush. "She was never meant to know, Sylvia. Sally's discovery means everything we have built is at stake." His confession spilled into the room like a toxin, seeding doubt in every ear pressed to doors and keyholes along the corridor. Miss Marple stepped closer, heart steady yet quickened by the certainty that truth now lay exposed for those wise enough to see it. As the voices fell into a tense silence, she caught the faintest note of realization breaking across Lady Sylvia's tone, a gasp so brittle it threatened to crack entirely when she whispered the words that confirmed Miss Marple's deepest suspicions. "All this time you lied about the child. You said she vanished, but she lived." In that instant, the echoes of footsteps reached Miss Marple's ear. Slow, deliberate steps descending the grand staircase, each one measured with a confidence that suggested the walker had nothing left to fear. She slipped back into the shadows, eyes narrowed as she watched Sir Robert's figure appear at the base of the stairs, his face pale and drawn, yet his gaze cold with the resolve of a man who believed the final hour belonged to him alone. The hush that fell over Marchwood Hall after Sir Robert's appearance was as deep and suffocating as the darkness that had wrapped the house through the long, restless night. Even as dawn's thin light pushed through the high windows, it brought no comfort to the grand halls, only a pale illumination that revealed the strain etched upon every face. Miss Marple stood in the shadowed archway near the base of the staircase, her keen eyes fixed upon Sir Robert as he moved into the drawing-room with a stiffness that betrayed the storm raging just beneath his careful composure. Lady Sylvia's eyes followed him like a hawk's, wide and shining with fury that burned hotter for having been held in check for so many years. Her voice broke the silence first, low and brittle but cutting as any blade. "You said the child vanished, Robert. You swore there was nothing left to haunt us." Each word fell heavy into the room, striking the polished floor like dropped stones. stirring a shiver through the servants gathered just beyond the threshold. Their ears pressed eagerly to the crack of the door as the unspoken truths they had long suspected now began to take shape. Sir Robert's shoulders lifted with a shuddering breath, his lips parting as he fought for control. When he spoke, his voice carried the exhaustion of a man who had spent a lifetime defending a secret he could no longer contain. It was not so simple, Sylvia. The affair, it was a mistake, born of weakness, but the child was real and alive, until Sally found proof. She threatened everything, demanded silence or compensation we could never afford to grant. His eyes darted to the diary, Miss Marple still held against her chest, the faintest flicker of rage sparking across his face as he realized his last line of defense had already crumbled. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, for as his confession hung in the air, a subtle sound broke through the strained quiet. Footsteps crossing the corridor outside the drawing room. Light but deliberate, unhurried yet unmistakable in their intent. Miss Marple's eyes lifted sharply, tracking the soft shuffle of shoes upon the marble, each step carrying a whisper of finality, each pause promising that the time for secrets was ending. She slipped further into the shadows as the figure of Lady Sylvia's niece appeared, pale and trembling, eyes shining with tears that caught the dawn's light as she stepped into the drawing room behind Sir Robert. The niece's voice, thin but unyielding, rose into the hush. I read the diary too. Sally showed me the letters, the telegrams, the proof of everything. I begged her not to say anything, but she said the truth was the only revenge she had left. Her words fell like ice into the room, freezing the breath in every chest, carrying with them the final confirmation that Sally's knowledge had not been conjecture, but certainty, and that certainty had placed her directly in the path of a desperate mind determined to protect a legacy already rotted by betrayal. Miss Marple, slipping quietly into the drawing room's far corner, lifted her eyes to the portraits lining the walls, rows of stern faces gazing down upon the gathering with expressions carved by time into masks of propriety and pride. Yet in the hush between each ragged breath, the truth rang clearer than any bell. The heirloom vanished from Marchwood's vaults had been sold to finance hush money. The telegrams demanded silence in exchange for safety, and the affair that birthed a child long. Thought vanished had planted the seed of scandal that Sally had come to reap. The room's hush grew thick again, as heavy as the knowledge now settling upon every heart. Outside the tall windows, the first rays of sun caught the dew upon the grass, turning it to fleeting jewels. Yet inside the hall, time itself seemed to hold its breath. Every eye fixed upon Miss Marple as she stepped forward at last, voice soft yet carrying the quiet power of a mind that had waited long enough. "One of you needed Sally silenced," she said, each word deliberate, calm, and final. But which one? The drawing room seemed to shrink around the assembled family as Miss Marple's question hung in the air, its echoes more deafening than any shouted accusation. Lady Sylvia swayed where she stood, hand gripping the back of a chair with white-knuckled intensity as her eyes darted between the niece's tear-streaked face and Sir Robert's stoic mask. The butler hovered at the door, shoulders hunched as though he might fold in upon himself under the weight of a truth he had long feared would one day demand to be spoken aloud. Beyond the open doors, servants crowded the corridor, faces pale, each breath held in anticipation of words that could unmake the world they had known within Marchwood's grand halls. Sir Robert straightened, lips pressing into a thin line as though to hold back a torrent of words. His eyes shifted to Lady Sylvia, dark and searching. Yet the look he found there was not one of comfort or shared purpose, but of cold calculation, a flicker of rage dancing across her expression like the first flash of lightning before a storm breaks. The silence swelled between them, pregnant with years of betrayal, half-heard confessions, and the unspoken knowledge that every choice made in the darkness now demanded its price in the light of morning. The niece's voice broke the silence, trembling but firm. "You both knew. You argued night after night because you feared what Sally would do. I heard you. I heard you both." Her words cracked at the edges, each syllable falling like a stone into the hush, stirring a shudder through the staff gathered just beyond the threshold. Every whispered suspicion they had ever shared seemed to find its voice in her confession. Every dark rumor once dismissed as idle gossip now ringing with the clarity of fact. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, for in the same instant the distant chime of the heirloom clock began to toll the hour, its low, resonant notes rolling through the halls like a funeral dirge. The sound carried with it a shift in the room's stillness, a subtle vibration of tension that made the very air feel brittle. The shadows thrown by the first true light of dawn caught upon the family portraits, rendering their painted eyes alive with judgment as they watched the living heirs fight to hold their crumbling legacy together. Miss Marple moved to the center of the room, her step deliberate, the diary pressed to her chest like a relic containing every key to the night's twisted path. Her voice rose above the hush, calm yet edged with a certainty that made every listener's heart thud painfully in their chest. This diary reveals what Sally discovered, a child who never vanished, a double life hidden beneath layers of deception, a legacy threatened by a single voice willing to speak the truth. And in this house where every footstep carries an alibi and every shadow harbors motive, the answer must be found not in what was claimed, but in what was hidden. She let her eyes travel across each face in turn. The butler whose silence had bought him years of quiet employment, the niece who held secrets passed down in whispers, Lady Sylvia who had mastered the facade of composure, yet trembled with every tick of the clock, and Sir Robert whose calm had already cracked beneath the weight of his own confession. In the hush, each drew breath as if it might be their last moment before truth's final blow. Every eye wide and unblinking, every heart pounding, with the certainty that the next words spoken would decide everything. The clock's final chime faded into silence, so absolute it seemed the house itself leaned forward to hear. Miss Marple's voice, low but unwavering, carried into the hush. "We gather here now because there is no more time for secrets. The truth must be spoken." Her gaze swept the room one last time, landing squarely upon Sir Robert's pale, drawn face before shifting to Lady Sylvia's clenched hands. And I invite you, dear listeners, if you have followed each clue and weighed each alibi, to subscribe so you will not miss the final hour when the truth of who covered Sally's face, and why, will at last be unmasked. Chapter 7. The False Confession. The hush inside the drawing-room was so complete it felt as if the walls themselves strained to hear the next word. Dust motes drifted lazily through the morning light, filtering in narrow beams across faces drawn tight with fear, guilt, and something like disbelief. Miss Marple's voice had barely faded when Lady Sylvia's composure cracked in a shuddering breath, the silence broken by a sob so sharp it sliced the tension like a knife, a sound that made the butler flinch and the niece clutch the edge of a chair for balance. And then, with a cry torn from somewhere deep within, Lady Sylvia fell to her knees, hands clasped as if in supplication, her confession pouring forth in a torrent that left every ear in the room ringing. "It was me," she gasped, words tumbling one over the other in a rush of panic and tears. "I went to her room that night. I argued with her. I covered her face because I could not bear the thought of our legacy vanishing in a scandal. She knew too much. She threatened us all. It was me." Her voice rose with each word until it cracked like old glass, eyes darting from Sir Robert's stunned face to Miss Marple's unreadable gaze. The servants in the doorway gasped softly, whispers stirring like dry leaves in the sudden storm of her confession, their voices rising with words like murderous, betrayal, and secrets exposed, each phrase sharp enough to draw blood from the fragile calm. Yet, as Lady Sylvia's sobs quieted, a subtle shift rippled through the room, the sort of change so slight it might have gone unnoticed if not for the absolute hush that followed her words. Miss Marple, her eyes narrowed, stepped slowly toward the kneeling woman, the diary clutched in her hand like a judge's gavel. Her voice came soft yet laced with an unmistakable certainty. "And yet, Lady Sylvia, you said you left her breathing. You claimed you fled when she fell silent. But did you tie the pillowcases not so tightly it left marks impossible for a single hand? Did you linger to play the lullaby, though the clock shows it rang out almost an hour after your footsteps were last heard by the night maid? Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, for in the hush that followed Miss Marple's questions, the details Lady Sylvia had offered began to unravel, each word exposing a timeline impossible to reconcile with the true events. The pillowcases knot, a double twist requiring strength and leverage. The soft notes of the lullaby drifting down the halls long after Lady Sylvia claimed she fled. Clues so precise and damning they pulled at the fragile threads of her confession until it sagged under its own contradictions. Eyes turned from Lady Sylvia to Sir Robert, then to the trembling niece, each face reflecting a shifting suspicion that spread like a stain across the polished floor. Miss Marple's voice rose just enough to reach every ear, calm yet edged with quiet authority. One must always consider what a person stands to gain with a confession and what, or whom, they might wish to protect. Her words drew a gasp from the niece, a strangled sound that suggested a truth barely contained. Outside the door, the butler stepped back as if struck, his face pale as milk. Lady Sylvia's tears slowed, her breathing ragged, eyes darting wildly as she searched the room for an anchor, for a sign that her sacrifice might yet save the one she meant to shield. The hush thickened, every person present frozen by the realization that this confession, shocking as it was, failed to match the facts, and in that silence, the question Miss Marple let hang in the air felt more damning than any accusation spoken aloud. "Do you think Sylvia is lying or protecting someone?" The words carried a challenge directly to you, dear listener. Consider the clues, weigh every alibi and motive, and comment below with your thoughts. For only by your insight might the truth be pulled from the shadows before the final hour strikes. The room's hush stretched thin as each occupant wrestled with the implications of Miss Marple's quiet, damning words. Lady Sylvia's shoulders trembled as she sank further to the polished floor, her sobs now softer, edged with something more desperate than grief. A plea, unspoken but unmistakable, that someone might take the weight of this truth from her shaking hands. Sir Robert's eyes moved restlessly from his wife's bowed head to the diary Miss Marple still held aloft like an unassailable witness, his breath coming faster now, ragged at the edges, every shallow exhale betraying a mind cornered by revelations that had begun to outpace his careful calculations. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, for in the tense stillness came a sound so slight it might have gone unnoticed had every ear not been straining. A faint click of wood upon stone, the subtle shift of a boot pivoting upon the marble floor, just outside the drawing-room doors. Miss Marple's head turned sharply, eyes narrowing as she caught the fleeting movement of a shadow beyond the threshold, tall, angular, gliding with a nervous urgency that suggested flight more than observation. And with that glimpse, the final piece of the night's tangled puzzle slipped into place within her mind, as clear and cold as the morning light breaking at last across Marchwood's ancient stones. Miss Marple stepped forward, voice calm yet carrying an authority that pinned every soul in the room where they stood. There is only one among us whose account places them near Sally's room both before and after the lullaby sounded, whose alibi is built upon another's word rather than their own, and whose presence alone explains every inconsistency in the night's timeline. Her eyes lifted to the doorway, locking upon the butler who stood rigid, eyes wide, hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. In that moment, every gaze in the drawing-room turned upon him, a wave of realization moving through the crowd like a breath of icy wind. The butler's face twitched as he took a single step backward, the line of his mouth tightening into a grimace that suggested not just fear, but rage long buried beneath layers of deference. His voice, when it came, was low and trembling. "I served this family faithfully for decades, but what choice had I when she threatened everything I worked for?" Sally came with her accusations, her hints of scandal, and she demanded payment I could not give, not for myself, nor for the mistress who trusted me beyond all others. Miss Marple's gaze stayed locked upon him, her voice soft but edged with steel. So you took matters into your own hands. You played the lullaby from the music room to mask your approach, then used your strength to tie the knot in the pillowcase after Lady Sylvia fled, ensuring Sally's silence. But you failed to account for one thing. The house never sleeps entirely, and shadows reveal more than you intended. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, for as the butler's eyes flicked to the side, a hand darted for the silver letter opener resting upon the sideboard. A motion so swift and desperate it drew a cry from the niece and sent Lady Sylvia scrambling backward. The butler's fingers closed around the handle, his arm rising in a blur of motion that spoke of a final, violent reaction, a last bid to escape the net tightening around him. But as he lunged toward the nearest door, a calm, deliberate figure stepped from the corridor shadows. Miss Marple, eyes bright and steady, hand raised in quiet command, voice sharp as a blade. "Stop!" The single word cut through the hush, halting him mid-motion, freezing the moment in a breathless tableau where time itself seemed to pause. The letter opener fell from the butler's grasp, clattering upon the marble with a metallic ring that echoed through the hall, the final sound of resistance before silence reclaimed the house. The clatter of the letter opener rang through the drawing-room like a warning bell, its echoes fading into a silence so complete it felt as if the grand house itself was holding its breath. The butler stood motionless, chest heaving, eyes wide with the realization that every carefully guarded secret, every whispered threat, every quiet act of loyalty twisted into betrayal had brought him to this very moment, pinned beneath the unyielding gaze of Miss Marple, whose calm had not wavered even as his final desperate act unfolded before her. Beyond the doors, servants clustered in hushed shock, their faces pale and eyes darting from the butler's rigid form to Lady Sylvia's tear-streaked cheeks and Sir Robert's ashen face. Each of them felt the weight of every clue Miss Marple had unearthed. The lullaby played at the wrong hour, the knot requiring more force than a panicked woman alone could manage. The contradictory alibis and the subtle pattern of footsteps traced through the halls by one who knew every creak and hidden corner. These pieces, scattered like shattered glass, now came together with a clarity that stunned all who witnessed it. Miss Marple stepped forward, the diary still held firmly in her hands, voice soft yet resonating through the hush. "I have long believed that a false confession often reveals more than silence. It shows who fears the truth most, and who stands to lose everything should that truth come to light." Her eyes shifted to Lady Sylvia, whose own gaze flickered with a mix of relief and horror, then to Sir Robert, who slumped heavily into the nearest chair, his breath coming in shallow gasps, and finally back to the butler, whose posture had begun to sag beneath the crushing certainty of exposure. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, for a sudden gust of wind swept through the open doors behind them, stirring the curtains like the wings of some great bird, carrying with it the faint, unmistakable scent of candle smoke and lavender, the scent that had haunted Sally's final night. It drifted through the room as if Sally herself still lingered, a silent witness to the last pieces of the puzzle falling into place. In that draught, the diary's pages fluttered open, revealing one final, cryptic line inked in a trembling hand. "If I vanish, know that it was never Lady Sylvia who wished me gone, but the one who has stood closest to her all along." A gasp escaped the niece as she read the words over Miss Marple's shoulder, the realization striking her like a blow. The butler's knees buckled, his voice cracking with a low, strangled groan. "I did it! I thought I could protect the family. She found letters in my desk, letters proving I had siphoned the heirloom's proceeds to cover debts. I tried to frighten her into silence, but when she resisted, his words trailed off into ragged sobs, shoulders slumping forward until he sank to the floor, the house's hush closing around him like a final judgment. Miss Marple's eyes lifted slowly, sweeping across the room to meet the gaze of every person gathered, each face pale, each mind reeling with the magnitude of the revelation, And then, with a voice as calm as it was unassailable, she said, "The truth is never as it first appears. Remember this, dear friends, and remember, too, that justice often walks quietly, but it never forgets." She turned to the camera, eyes shining with quiet challenge. "Who among you suspected the butler? Comment below with your thoughts. And if you wish to see the final hour revealed in all its shocking clarity, be sure to subscribe so you do not miss the breathtaking conclusion." And as the grand clock began to toll once more, its deep notes reverberating through Marchwood's ancient halls, the family stood gathered in stunned silence. The secrets of decades laid bare, the facade shattered, and only the final, unexpected twist remaining to bring this mystery to its extraordinary end. Chapter 8. The Face Uncovered. The hush that settled upon Marchwood Hall in the wake of the butler's confession felt deeper than any silence that had come before, a heavy, suffocating stillness that pressed into every corner of the grand drawing-room. Dust motes drifted in the pale shafts of dawnlight slanting through tall windows, the air thick with the scent of spent candle wax and the bitter tang of secrets dragged unwilling into the open. Miss Marple stood at the center of the room, her eyes clear, voice low but carrying the final, unshakable truth to every ear. There is no doubt now. The butler did not simply act to protect the household. He was driven by something more personal, more brutal. She let her words sink in, her gaze sweeping across faces drawn tight with shock. Sir Robert slumped in his chair, eyes unfocused, as if the weight of betrayal had struck him a physical blow. Lady Sylvia, her hands trembling upon the back of a chair, cheeks slick with silent tears, the niece, pale as milk, eyes wide with the horror of understanding, and the staff clustered at the edges of the room, hearts pounding as they absorbed the enormity of what had unfolded in these dark, twisting hours. The butler stood at the room center, shoulders hunched, his breathing ragged, eyes darting to the doors as if calculating a path of escape he knew would never open to him. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, for in the silence came the soft creak of wood as Miss Marple stepped forward, her calm voice weaving each clue into a tapestry that revealed the truth in its sharpest light. A thread of blue wool from the butler's gloves was found snagged upon the pillowcase. Its color matched only his uniform, not a single garment belonging to Lady Sylvia. And here! She held up the small brass candlestick, its polished surface catching the faint morning light. A smear of soot from the fireplace, near Sally's room. Yet this piece was missing from the butler's service tray the very night of her smothering. These details, overlooked by many, spoke volumes to anyone who cared to listen. A strangled sound escaped the butler's lips, a low moan tinged with the exhaustion of a man who had lost every advantage. Miss Marple continued, her words soft yet edged with a finality that left no room for doubt. "You loved Lady Sylvia, in your own quiet, hopeless way. You believed the only way to protect her was to silence Sally forever. And when Lady Sylvia began to suspect the truth, you twisted the evidence to cast suspicion upon her, hoping to end the investigation before it began." A gasp broke from Lady Sylvia's throat, her eyes snapping to the butler's face, horror and disbelief mingling in a single, breathless question unspoken on her lips. The butler's shoulders sagged lower still, his voice cracking as he whispered, "I had to. If the truth of the child had emerged, if Sally had gone to the police or the papers, it would have destroyed you. I couldn't bear it." The hush grew heavier still, the silence broken only by the quiet ticking of the grand clock on the mantel, each measured beat counting out the final moments of a mystery that had begun with a lullaby in the dark and would now end beneath the stark light of dawn. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room one last time, her voice calm, precise, yet filled with a weight that left every heart aching. But there is one last truth yet to come, one final piece of this puzzle hidden in the final pages of Sally's diary. The grand clock's ticking grew louder in the charged hush that followed Miss Marple's words, each measured beat reverberating through the drawing-room like the heartbeat of Marchwood Hall itself. Every person gathered seemed frozen in place, eyes fixed upon the small, battered diary Miss Marple now held open with careful hands. Its final pages fluttered slightly in the morning draught, as if eager to share their secrets after being locked away for so long, their thin paper fragile beneath the weight of truths waiting to emerge. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, for as Miss Marple began to read, her voice low but carrying, the words on the page shifted the entire shape of the night's tragedy. "I have kept his letters close to my heart all these years," Sally had written, the ink shaky but unmistakably hers. "I know the stories they told me cannot all be true, but I must try to see him, to know the man who gave me life, before it is too late. I do not want money or inheritance. I want only to meet my father." A hush fell deeper still across the room, the sound of the ticking clock swelling until it seemed the only noise in the world. The niece covered her mouth with a trembling hand, tears spilling from her eyes. Lady Sylvia slumped into a chair, breath coming in shallow gasps. Sir Robert buried his face in his hands. But it was the butler whose head jerked upward, eyes wide, the truth dawning upon him with a force that drew a strangled cry from his chest, a sound so raw it cut through every heart in the room. Miss Marple's gaze met his with quiet finality as she spoke the words he could not bear to hear. She was not blackmailing you or the family. She planned to reunite with her father, a man still living here in St. Mary Mead. A single tear slipped down the butler's cheek, the final confirmation of a secret he had spent decades concealing, the child born of an affair he had never spoken of, the daughter he had watched from afar as she grew up in hardship, his silent devotion twisted into a fear that had driven him to unspeakable choices. His confession came in a hoarse whisper. "I thought if the truth came out, they would cast me out. I thought I could end it before she spoke." Miss Marple's voice softened, heavy with sorrow but unwavering, as she let the words of the diary settle upon the hearts of all who listened. Her last words were not threats, they were hopes. She wished only to know you. And now, in this final hour, your brutal desperation has stolen from both of you the one chance you might have had. The clock struck once, its bell deep and sonorous, the note lingering in the silence, as every face turned toward the butler, now slumped in quiet defeat. The soft shuffle of feet came from the hall as constables stepped forward to take him gently by the arms, his hands limp, head bowed, eyes fixed on nothing as the weight of what he had done pressed him down like stone. And still the hush lingered, deeper than before, as though the very stones of Marchwood Hall now absorbed the final confession. The air thick with the ache of a reunion never realized, a bond lost forever in the shadows of pride, fear, and secrets kept far too long. The constables led the butler from the grand drawing-room, his steps slow and heavy as he passed beneath the stern gazes of generations immortalized in oil upon the hall's walls. The portraits, bathed now in the pale light of dawn, seemed to watch in silent judgment as the man who had served Marchwood longer than many of them had lived left the place he had once called home, his head bowed not in defiance, but in the hollow acceptance of a life undone by secrets exposed and a final, violent reaction he could never take back. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, for in the hush that followed his departure, Miss Marple's eyes fell once more upon the diary resting in her hands, its final pages whispering the last, most devastating truth of all. Sally's final words, scribbled with desperate haste, as if she feared the ink would run out before her heart's wish was set down. "He will know me by the locket I wear. I will tell him I forgive him for vanishing, and that I only ever wanted a father's smile." The words carried through the quiet, their fragile hope lingering like the faintest breath of perfume upon the morning air, curling into every corner of the grand hall as if Sally's spirit itself drifted through the old stones. A tremor passed through Lady Sylvia as she listened, her eyes brimming with tears that spilled unchecked down her cheeks. Sir Robert raised his face at last, gaze distant, lips parted as if to speak, but finding no words. The niece pressed a trembling hand to her heart, head bowed, and throughout Marchwood Hall, the servants who had gathered in hushed knots began to weep openly, their sorrow echoing in the stillness like the softest rain upon stone. Miss Marple's voice, quiet but unwavering, rose to fill the silence with the last, unanswerable reflection. In a place as quiet as St. Mary Mead, secrets bloom like nightshade, thriving in the shadows, beautiful to some, poisonous to all. Her words settled upon the hearts of every soul gathered, their quiet truth heavier than any accusation. And as she closed the diary with careful hands, the grand clock began to tick once more, its steady beat a reminder that time, unfeeling and relentless, would carry all things forward even as it left some hopes forever behind. The camera pulled back from the hall's tall windows, rising above the hedgerows and the dew-drenched gardens, the village of St. Mary Mead emerging into the first light of dawn. Quiet lanes wound like silver ribbons through misty fields, the distant church bell silent, the village at peace once more, or so it would seem for now. And as the screen faded to black, the only sound remaining was the soft, unhurried ticking of the clock, counting the moments until the next secret might bloom in the hush of this quiet, watchful place. Credits rolled over the silence, every name passing in respectful quiet as the ticking clock carried on, its measured rhythm the final heartbeat of a tale told, yet never entirely finished. And so the final hour strikes upon Marchwood Hall, the secrets once buried now laid bare, the truth of Sally's last wish haunting these quiet lanes long after the sun has risen. But mysteries like this never truly end. They leave echoes in every shadow, whispers in every silence. Tell me, what do you believe? Could forgiveness have changed this fate, or was the tragedy sealed by fear alone? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your theories breathe life into every story we unravel together. And if this tale held you spellbound, if you yearn for more journeys into the darkest corners of human nature and the quietest places where secrets bloom, I invite you, kindly but firmly, to subscribe now, so you never miss the next mystery waiting in the hush. Until we meet again, remember, in St. Mary Mead and beyond, the truth always finds a way to the light.